Hey guys, and welcome to the first part of our sexual and asexual reproduction mini unit this week. So first things first, before we can really talk about asexual versus sexual reproduction, we need to talk about what is reproduction. There we go. So reproduction, in its most broadest general form, is just the creation of new life. Could be having a baby, could be producing a new blade of grass from a seed, it could be any number of things, as long as it has made new life. So it can be seeds growing, it can be mitosis happening, right? You've got one cell splitting into two living cells. So living things will always reproduce living things. Living things will always reproduce living things that are like themselves. We call their newborn offspring. So what this means is, like, if I've got a cat, I'm not expecting it to give birth to a dog, right? If I've got a red rose, and I have red rose seeds, I'm not expecting those to grow into tulips. They should reproduce things that are similar to themselves. Now, they don't have to be identical, but they should be, pretty close. Now, reproduction, what is it? Well, it's a biological mechanism. What that means is it's something that living things do, and it's essential for continuing and diversifying species. Let's look at it from a human being lens here. If human beings couldn't reproduce, well, it wouldn't be long until there were no human beings left, right? We need the continuity of our species. We need our species to continue, so we have to reproduce. Another thing that reproduction often does is it helps diversify. It helps with the diversity of species. All human beings are slightly different than all other human beings. We are diverse. And that's a really, really important, really good thing. If all human beings were identical, we would all have the exact same weaknesses and the exact same strengths. So let's say that we have a single type of human and we are all the exact same human. Same hair color, eye color, same immune system, same everything. We'd all look exactly the same, be like clone world. Well, if we're all really weak to a certain illness, let's say the COVID-19 virus as an example, and that virus hits, guess what? Everybody dies. Human beings, game over. As it stands now, every human being has genetic differences and diversity, so that, yeah, some people are really affected by it. Some people get sick and some people are dying of it, but a lot of people aren't. Many people have a strong immune system for one reason or another that happens to be good at fighting that particular virus. So while some human beings may die just because of the diversity of species, they're not as good at fighting off that particular virus, many human beings will survive. And so as a species, humanity gets to continue. So diversity of species, very important. So what basically it is, the production of new individuals that are more or less similar in form to their parent organisms, and it serves to perpetuate or increase the species, right? Make more of yourself. This may be achieved by a number of means. There's a lot of different ways to actually make more of yourself, and we are going to categorize these as either sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. So two different ways to reproduce. That's the topic of this week. Today, specifically, we're looking at asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is reproduction in which new individuals are made from a single parent without the formation of gametes. Big important word there. So gametes are specialized cells used for reproduction. So gametes are just reproductive cells. Little side note here. In humans, we have two gametes. We have either sperm cells, this is the male gamete, or we have egg cells, or ova, which are the female gamete in human beings. Now, some plants have different gametes, but here's the deal. If we're doing asexual reproduction, no gametes. No sperm cells, no egg cells, no pollen, no nothing. Single parent, nobody else involved. I just mean like a single individual person, just me. Here, Mr. Burns standing here. I'm going to make more humans, just me, myself. I'm going to make a bunch of little mini Burnses running around. No gametes, nothing. So how do we do that? Well, asexual reproduction is real complicated. There's 10 different types of asexual reproduction. So I'm going to go through them one at a time, identify them, describe them, show you an example of them, so you can kind of jot down into your little filler there the examples, and if you want to go online, maybe find a picture of the different things that do it, make your notes real pretty. So, 1, binary fission. This you've kind of looked at already. It's basically mitosis. It's the splitting of an organism into two new organisms, approximately the same size. So the example here would be bacteria. Mostly you're going to find this in simple one-celled plants and animals. Now, we don't call it mitosis because mitosis is for body cells, and they're not technically an organism. They're not going to live on their own. But there are things that are very similar, like bacteria, that are very small, single-celled, that are their own organism, and they can reproduce by doing basically the same thing. So it'd be like me standing here, and all of a sudden I split down the middle into two kind of slightly smaller Mr. Burns that are about the same size as each other. And they're just, I eat some food, grow real big and fat, and then do it again. Binary fission. No other partner required, no sperm cells, no egg cells required. I've got my own copy of me. Second one you see sometimes is called budding. So a bud forms on an organism, grows, and eventually breaks away. So examples of things that do this would be yeast, which you probably have at home when you bake with, things called hydras, or corals, like coral reefs. These are three different organisms that will often do budding. So this would be like me, Mr. Burns, standing here, and a tiny little lump of cells grows out of my shoulder, and after a while, it just kind of breaks off, and it's a little tiny mini Burns running around. That would be budding. So I've got my own main cell, which would be me, and then a little bud grows, a tiny small version. Let's get a different color going on here. So here would be the main organism, the Mr. Burns in this metaphor. And here's the mini Burns just kind of growing off my shoulder. And at some point, that mini Burns just snaps off. And hey, look, it's another me. And it'll grow and get bigger and life is good. So that's budding. Obviously, humans don't do that. That'd be weird. Cloning. Now, this is a cool one. Everybody, when they hear cloning, they think sci-fi, they think Star Wars and Clone Wars and all this craziness of copying people and someone's going to get your hair and make a mini version of you. Cloning is something that actually happens both naturally and artificially, and it's a process by which identical offspring are produced from just a single cell or tissue. So in bees, they're a really common natural example. Ants do this as well, I believe. If you have a bee egg that is unfertilized, so it's a single cell, it's just an egg cell, no sperm cell involved, it can actually start dividing by mitosis all the way into a mature adult. Now, it's going to be missing some bits if it does this, right? Because it's only going to have half the DNA it needs. And so I believe in bees that all of those unfertilized eggs become drone bees, like worker bees. Like it won't become a queen bee or any of the, the important ones because it's just a clone is missing some stuff. But it's basically called cloning. Whatever laid that egg, it's only got that bee's DNA. So it will be a genetic copy of only that bee's DNA. And so it's technically a type of cloning. They do give it a special name. They call it Parthenogenesis. I like that word. Just, I don't know, sounds super cool. Parthenogenesis. Another example of cloning are florists. Florists are people who do flower arrangements and things. Now, this is obviously a terrible picture because it's black and white and flowers should probably be colored. But the idea is flowers, like humans, all different shapes and sizes. So when you get a rose that looks just right, let's say this rose, just right, it's real pretty. Instead of trying to breed it to make more roses, where you're going to be mixing it genetically and kind of playing a bit of the lottery with it, you can clone that rose and end up with the exact same, literally the exact same rose, the exact same shape, the exact same color. And so most florists find that flower that they like, just the perfect, and they clone it over and over and over again. So they can get the same shapes and sizes and colors. Parthenogenesis. This is our official definition here. You could jot this in your notes somewhere. I know there's not a spot for it, but parthenogenesis, it's the process by which an unfertilized haploid egg matures into a new organism by itself. Oh yeah, there it is. In bees, unfertilized eggs become the male drones, whereas if a fertilized egg happens, it's going to become the female workers or queen bees, depending on what they eat. So parthenogenesis happens as well. There is artificial cloning happening like literally right now of larger animals and not just plants. Like it was back in the 90s actually where they first cloned a sheep named Dolly. But now it's really popular for like horses and like fancy breeding stock and stuff like that. They do some cloning for stuff like that. And there is research, I'm sure, being done into human cloning. However, that is illegal, at least in North America and most every other developed state. So you cannot do reproductive research on human beings. It's generally considered fairly unethical when it comes to stuff like cloning people, because if this technology developed, it could get to the point where someone's like, hey, you left your hair on the floor, and they could grow a mini version of you, which I mean, it wouldn't look just like it would start as a baby, right? It would have to grow, and it would take 20 years so it was actually like an adult or whatever. But theoretically, that's the possibility of cloning, which is kind of crazy. Cuttings, number 4. Cuttings is real common when you have plants that you want to grow. Some plants, you don't need anything except for a stem or a leaf. You cut a stem or a leaf off a plant, you stick it in a bit of water, and you can kind of see there, just shoot some little roots out. You just put the stem in there, put the leaf in there, and roots come out. And so you sit it in water for a few days, you see the roots start to grow, you put it in dirt, and it'll grow into a full new plant. Geraniums are one of the most common ones that people will propagate using cuttings. Number 5, fragmentation. This is when a small piece or fragment breaks away and grows into a new individual. Very common with funguses, like mushrooms. And some worms will do this as well, where a piece breaks off and grows into another. Often this is kind of like an intentional thing. Like they will have a piece that is almost designed to fragment or break off. Not so much in worms, but definitely with fungi, where if the piece snaps off, it'll land somewhere and it'll just grow into a new mushroom colony. Grafting is super neat. Grafting is the transplantation of living tissue from one individual to another individual, or to another location on the same individual. And this is always artificial. There's no natural version of grafting. But we do grafting with human beings. If you get burnt really, really badly, let's say on your arms, and your skin is so damaged that it can't function properly, like it can't sweat, can't go, that is going to cause problems. They can actually take skin from somewhere else on your body, small patches, and put it on your arm and graft it there, and it'll start growing and it'll act as regular skin. So they do skin grafts that way. They've been working on transplanting skin from one human to another, which obviously has issues matching hue and shade and all that stuff, but it's doable. But most commonly you see this reproduction version grafting on apple trees. Apple trees are really neat in that, you know, there's like green apples and red, right? Granny Smiths, you got the Red Delicious, you got the Gala apples, there's so many different kinds of apples. But they're all apple trees, which means if I take an apple tree, let's say this here is my apple tree, and I cut it, and I stick 2 different apples, one's a Granny Smith and one's a Red Delicious, I got a green apple, and I stick them both in there, and I tape them all up and let it sit, they'll grow together and actually start growing as 2 separate branches out of the same trunk. So what you end up with is you end up with a tree that has multicolored apples, which is kind of crazy, but you can grow as many apples as you want, as many different kinds as you want on an apple tree. Let's see if I can find a good picture of this here. No? So you can let me search? That'd be too easy? Yeah, it's too bad. All right. Well, either way, I'm going to tell you right now, Google like a multi-apple tree or a grafted apple tree. They've even done it with multiple citrus fruits where you could have like lemons and limes growing on the same tree by grafting a branch from a lime tree onto a lemon tree. Everything else is growing lemons. That one branch, it's going to keep spitting out limes. So very common with apples and citrus fruits because they're so closely related. You can graft them and you end up growing all kinds of fruit. You can make like fruit salad trees basically. All right, number 7 here, we got layering. Layering is a method of growing roots out of branches or shoots of a parent plant. You just bury them. So here's my plant. It's got, you know, little branches sticking up. I grab one of the branches and I bend it and I just bury it under the dirt. I have some brown here for dirt. Do I have brown? Let's use tan. So here's my dirt. I just bury it under the dirt there. And before I know it, that piece of branch grows some roots. And then before long, I've got a new plant starting to grow out of there. Really common with raspberry plants. They will almost always do this. So if you see a raspberry bush, it seems like it gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And what's happening is it's reproducing by layering. One of those branches flops over and touches the ground and it sprouts another plant right beside it. So you end up with like bunches of raspberry plants that are right beside each other. Technically, it's all kind of the same plant. They're all identical to each other because they all came from the same original plant, which is kind of neat. 8 is regeneration. Now, this is generally accidental, whereas fragmentation, breaking a part off, would be an intentional way of reproducing. Regeneration is more often accidental. It's the process of repairing injured cells or regrowing lost body parts. So we all know that you cut off like a lizard's tail, right? You can regrow the tail. Cool. There are some animals where, if we're using that lizard as a metaphor, the lizard would regrow his tail, and the tail would regrow an entire lizard. And suddenly you have two lizards, and it's reproduced. Sea stars, starfish, and planaria, which are flatworms, they do this. If you cut them the right way, like this planaria, I cut it in half, the head half grows a butt, and the butt half grows a head. And suddenly you've got two worms. There's a really funny story about, there's some fishermen, and sea stars, they were causing a lot of problems. They were all over the place. And so these fishermen were catching the sea stars. So let's draw a little sea star here. There it is. They were cutting the sea star, and then they're like, all right, well, I can't just keep these things. You leave them out on the shore, they're going to start to rot and smell like fish, right? It's going to be gross. So how do we kill them? So, well, let's just chop them up and throw them back in the water. And so they would, cut them a couple times and throw them back in the water. A couple chops back in the water. Now, this little bit out here might die, but guess what? That one starfish just became two starfish, because both those halves can regrow the rest of the fish. So these fishermen were trying to solve their starfish issue, and so they chopped up the starfish and threw them back in the water, and ended up causing huge problems with a massive explosion in the number of starfish in their ecosystem. So starfish will do that. Sea stars, I think sea stars and starfish might be the same thing. I'm not a marine biologist expert, and planaria as well, flatworms. There are other examples, but these are kind of your most common ones for regeneration. Number 9 is spores and spore formation. Now, you could spend an entire day talking about how this actually works, because it's pretty cool and a little complicated, but at the end of the day, the idea is that a reproductive cell can grow into a new individual. So here's me, it's Mr. Burns, doing my thing. Normally, I would use whatever other form of reproduction, but times are hard, right? There's not very much food, or it's really hot outside, or something that's not good for survival is happening around me. And usually that will trigger what's called spore formation in different organisms. And so I would grow a little stalk off of my arm, and in that stalk would be a bunch of little cells called spores. And these spores are each mini versions of me that, if they find somewhere that is hospitable, that is good for life, they will start to grow into an identical copy of me. Now, the crazy thing about spores and spore formation is they tend to be, I'm not going to say indestructible, but pretty darn close to indestructible. They can withstand like years without food or light or water. And then the second they get what they need, they'll start growing again. Spores are crazy. There's actually a person whose job at NASA, the National Space Agency in the US there, whose job it is to try to get rid of spores on spaceships. Because even though they go rocketing through the atmosphere and they go out into outer space and they get exposed to all this radiation, spores could likely survive that. And it would really suck to go to the moon or to go to Mars looking for life somewhere, and it turns out it's just the spores you brought with you that fell off your boots or off your spaceship onto the surface and have been growing since the last time you left. So they have a guy whose job it is, or girl, I'm not sure, whose job is literally just to scrub down the spaceship and all its bits to make sure we don't contaminate planets we go to visit. Because spores are so hard to get rid of and can live through almost anything. So example of things that do spore, bread molds, and mushrooms. Very common to have spores for bread molds and mushrooms. And last one we're going to look at is just straight up, it's called vegetative propagation. This is probably the one you're most familiar with. If you've ever seen little shoots start to come out of your potatoes or out of your onions, that's vegetative propagation. It's a single organism, it's just a potato. There's no, sex cells, no sperm, no egg involved, just a potato. And it grows a little shoot. If I take a potato, I cut it in half, and I bury those halves, they're both going to grow into 2 new potato plants. So 1 potato, 2 potato. Easy. That's vegetative propagation. So some things can do this, like potatoes and onions. Also, tulips or lilies, they have things called bulbs. Those bulbs will sit under the ground and just keep growing more tulips all year long. You can move that bulb, it'll grow tulips somewhere else. So that's called vegetative propagation, where vegetables, often potatoes, onions, but also some flowers, will grow bulbs or tubers that just shoot up. Now, in the case of potatoes, we eat the actual bulb, or the tuber, sorry. We eat that. Potato is called a tuber. We actually eat it. But if you were to plant it, it's its own version of reproductive cell. It'll just grow into a plant. So that's asexual reproduction. That's all the different types, the ways it happens. Oh, one thing we should talk about here. One more slide I'm going to add real quick. What we don't like about asexual reproduction. So this is a bonus slide for you guys. Asexual reproduction. Pros and cons. Pros. It's easy. You don't need a partner. It's low effort. You're not out looking for a partner. You don't need to find a mate, so to speak. It's very easy to do asexual reproduction. Con. And this is a pretty big con. No genetic diversity. So if I don't have gametes involved, if I'm growing a mini Burns off my shoulder and that's going to be me, it's going to be a clone of me. It's going to be a copy of me. It's going to be genetically identical to me. Any weaknesses I have will also be in that organism. So it's generally not ideal. So the pro of asexual reproduction is it's easy to do. You don't need a partner. It's a fairly simple way of doing reproduction. So you don't have to worry about like having genetic defects or any issues that might cause something to go wrong. It's just, you just copy it. But again, the no genetic diversity thing is a huge con for asexual reproduction, which is why a lot of animals, or plants for that matter, generally do sexual reproduction unless times are hard and they have it as a backup method. Now, it's not always, like bacteria only do asexual reproduction, but it is often, I'm going to call it secondary, not backup, but same idea, is often a secondary method of reproducing. Behind sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction would be the main goal because that would give you genetic diversity, which is better. But if there is some reason why that's not going to happen, there are no partners around, there's a drought or a flood or something bad is happening, it's going to be hard to find a partner and actually produce successfully, then a lot of different organisms have a backup method, a secondary method that is asexual in some way, shape, or form. So that is going to wrap up our asexual reproduction lesson. So hopefully that's all the information you need. You went through and could fill out some notes or anything. And yeah, I will talk to you guys soon when we look at sexual reproduction.